When nature strikes back, no wall, weapon, or will can guarantee survival. From Alaska's shattered lodges to Kamchatka's raging rivers and Slovakia's frozen ravines, these encounters show what happens when man meets fury on its own ground. Grizzlies tear through cabins, moose charge from the mist, and black bears refuse to back down. Even thunder and terrain turn allies into threats when fear takes hold. Each story is a reminder that, in the wild, survival isn't promised. It's earned. Watch till the end. It was November 2nd, 2025, on the southern edge of Kodiak Island, where the cold air rolled down from the high ridges and settled thick over the spruce valleys. A group of 9 hunters had gathered inside a remote wooden lodge built decades earlier near a river mouth known for its salmon runs. The men had spent the entire day hiking the steep, brushy slopes, scanning the alder-covered hillsides for late-season Sitka black-tailed deer. Among them was Eric Halloway, a seasoned guide who had spent years leading hunts across Alaska's wild terrain. He was joined by friends and fellow hunters, locals and visitors who came for the challenge of the island's rugged country. By nightfall, their rifles were cleaned, their boots drying by the stove, and the scent of smoked venison and fish oil lingered inside the small cabin. Outside, the world was silent except for the steady patter of rain and the wind moving through the tall trees. The group stored their gear and supplies near the porch. Meat scraps sealed in coolers and buckets of fish oil from the day's catch. They had no way of knowing that the heavy scent carried far beyond the clearing. In the distance, through the thick darkness of the forest, something large was already moving. The Kodiak bear had followed the wind. It was enormous, one of the island's true giants, its coat thick with the season's growth and its body swollen with strength. It had spent the last week scavenging along the shorelines, but now, drawn by the unmistakable smell of meat, it approached the lodge. Each step it took left deep prints in the wet ground. Inside, the hunters talked quietly while the fire crackled. Midnight passed unnoticed until the night was torn apart by a sound like thunder. The bear hit the side of the lodge with staggering force. The wooden wall bowed inward, the beams groaning under pressure. Before anyone could react, the creature struck again, splintering planks and shattering a window. The men grabbed for their rifles, but confusion and panic filled the narrow room. A third blow came, and the front wall gave way completely. The bear charged through the doorway, sending wood fragments flying. The table overturned, lanterns crashed, and the cabin filled with shouts and chaos. 2 hunters were caught near the entrance as the collapsing beams fell. The rest stumbled toward the rear, desperate to escape. Some dove through a window as the massive animal swung its paws, smashing furniture and clawing through the debris. The small lodge that had once been a refuge had turned into a scene of complete destruction within seconds. The roaring of the bear and the sound of breaking timber filled the cold night, echoing across the valley. The bear's roar faded only for a breath as it spun through the open space, its weight shaking the broken floorboards. The hunters who escaped through the back window slipped into the wet grass outside, landing hard as the cold air hit their faces. Behind them, the lodge shook again as the bear pushed deeper inside, knocking aside shattered chairs and crushed packs. The fire from the stove flickered wildly, throwing shadows across the ruined room. Eric scrambled to his feet in the darkness, his hands shaking from shock and the freezing ground soaking through his sleeves. He called out for the others, but only muffled movements answered him. The remaining hunters pulled themselves away from the collapsing building, some limping, some clutching cuts and bruises from splintered wood and falling beams. They gathered behind a cluster of rocks near the tree line, watching as the animal continued its rampage. Inside the lodge, the bear circled, breathing heavily as it shoved through the last standing section of wall. It crushed the table completely, sending pieces sliding across the floor. After nearly a minute of destruction, the enormous animal turned toward the open doorway, its head lowering as it stepped back into the night. The storm clouds hid the moon, and the creature vanished into the shadows as silently as it had come. When the forest had grown still again, the hunters moved toward the wreckage with slow, careful steps. The front half of the building sagged against the ground, the beams snapped, and the roof tilted. The two men killed in the collapse lay half buried under splintered boards. The others stood in stunned silence, each one shaken by how quickly the night had changed. With no shelter left, they worked together under the weak beam of headlamps, pulling debris aside and gathering what supplies they could still reach. Injured men were treated with basic field care, their hands stiff from the cold. They built a small fire at a safe distance using dry wood from a nearby stump. By sunrise, the scene was stark and quiet. The lodge was nothing more than a scatter of broken walls and torn packs. Deep prints in the mud marked the bear's path back into the forest, their size leaving no doubt about the power that had struck in the night. The hunters stood together, exhausted and grim, understanding that the island's wild giants allowed no mistakes and offered no warnings. In October 2022, in the eroded clay and shale-rich badlands and rolling plains of eastern Montana, Troy Maddox moved slowly across the rough ground with steady patience. He had grown up in open country like this, learning early how the wind shaped the land and how the animals used every dip and shadow to stay hidden. His friend Ben Keller, taller and quieter, had spent years studying pronghorn habits, often traveling long distances just to watch them run across the plains. Both men loved the calm hours of glassing, the steady breathing, and the simple focus of searching the empty fields for any sign of movement. The land around them looked endless. Long ridges rose and fell like frozen waves, their clay sides cracked from heat and storms. Dust blew over the flats in thin lines, carried by sharp October wind. The cold air tasted dry, and the sky stretched wide and pale over the basin. They had walked for hours before spotting the giant pronghorn bedded under a wind-carved ledge. Its horns arched high, and its body looked strong even from far away. Troy and Ben dropped to the ground and began a slow crawl across the ridge. Their elbows dug into the grainy clay, each movement sending tiny clouds of dust into the wind. They planned to reach a better angle at around 250 yards, a distance they both felt comfortable with. The wind stung their eyes, but they kept pushing forward, eager to stay hidden. The animal below them rested calmly, unaware of the careful approach happening above. Then the air changed. A deep pressure settled over the basin and the wind paused for a brief, unnatural stillness. Troy felt the shift in his chest before he heard anything. A sharp crack of thunder suddenly rolled across the land, so loud it seemed to jump from one ridge to the next. The sound hit the pronghorn like a shock. The great buck snapped to its feet, its body tense and confused as the storm built overhead. Before Troy and Ben could steady themselves, everything happened at once. Lightning slammed into a ridge behind them, bursting with a flash that lit the clay walls in white. The ground shuddered. A second later, a wild roar filled the basin, not from weather but from movement. Fast, heavy, and close. A herd of antelope exploded from a hidden coulee, racing in a tight pack, fleeing the crash of thunder. Dust shot up around their hooves as they ran with desperate speed. The giant buck from below sprang forward at the head of the herd, but instead of fleeing across the flats, it charged straight up the slope toward the two hunters. Troy tried to lift his .2506, but the fragile bank under his chest broke apart. Clay crumbled, sliding under him like a loose wave. He dropped hard and slid 10 feet down the ridge. Ben fell beside him, the slope pulling them both into the direct path of the sprinting herd. Troy scrambled, Clay clinging to his sleeves. Hooves thundered past in a blur of tan bodies and flying dust. A doe shot past Ben so close, her leg brushed the toe of his boot. Another antelope leaped over Troy's shoulder, its legs flashing across his vision before disappearing. Troy kept his body tight against the clay as the herd surged around him, their speed turning the air into a rush of heat and dust. The antelope leaping over his shoulder vanished into the storm haze in a blink, followed by the pounding of more hooves slicing across the slope. Ben pressed himself into the crumbling ridge, trying to keep from sliding farther as loose dirt shifted under his weight. The animals darted past in a blur, their bodies stretched with full force as they tried to escape the chaos behind them. The giant buck led the charge, muscles tight, eyes wild from fear and the shock of thunder. It bolted past the place where the hunters had crawled minutes earlier, sending clay chunks scattering down the incline. The ground shook lightly with every strike of its hooves, and for a moment Troy felt the entire slope vibrate as if it might collapse. The wind carried dust into the air, turning the scene into a mix of movement and storm. Ben shielded his face as the last of the herd raced by, hooves kicking loose stones and bits of dry brush. When the herd finally veered away toward a distant rise, the noise faded into the growing storm. Troy lay still for a moment, chest rising and falling, trying to steady his breathing. His clothing was coated in clay and scratches lined his arms from the slide. Ben pushed himself up with slow, careful movements. The ridge around them looked torn apart, covered in deep hoof marks, scattered dirt, and broken plants. The ledge above had fresh cracks from where the animals had passed, and pieces of rock had broken free. They sat on the slope, letting the shock settle. The storm clouds rolled over the basin, covering the land in gray shadow. The sharp scent of clay and dust filled the air, and faint thunder still echoed across distant ridges. Troy brushed dirt from his hands, realizing how quickly a simple crawl had turned into a dangerous fight against nature. Ben looked at the broken ground, understanding how close they had come to being crushed or thrown down the slope. They slowly climbed back to stable ground, stepping carefully on firmer patches of clay. When they reached a higher ridge, both men paused and looked across the wide basin. The herd had vanished into the far side of the valley, leaving only the marks they carved into the land. The clearing below was quiet again, but the memory of hooves and thunder still pressed heavily on their minds. They returned to camp before the storm grew stronger, moving with tired steps. Their bodies were bruised, their gear was covered in dust, and their nerves were worn thin. The wind picked up as they walked, carrying the reminder of how fear, storms, and wild animals could collide without warning. In the days that followed, both men spoke often about the close call, knowing that the Badlands held dangers far beyond what they came to hunt. In October 2025, in the deep cold of the Kamchatka wilderness, Sergei Volkov moved along a wide riverbank wrapped in quiet fog. He had grown up in a small village not far from the valley, spending his childhood learning how to read tracks, cross fast rivers, and move silently through the wild. His father had taught him how the land changed with each season, how bears followed salmon runs, and how moose prints looked after rain. By adulthood, Sergei had become known for his calm nature and steady steps, never rushing through the forest unless the weather demanded it. He carried a .308 hunting rifle, worn smooth from years of use. His backpack held simple gear, dry clothes, a rope, and a small set of tools. Sergei preferred long, quiet days on the land, following signs of wildlife and studying their paths. That early October morning, he left before sunrise, hoping to find a large moose he had seen days earlier. The river beside him was cold and fast, splitting into many small channels over gravel and sand. A thick fog hugged the water, turning every shape pale and unclear. As he walked, the world felt muted. The only sounds were the soft crunch of wet stones under his boots and the distant rush of the river. Moose tracks pressed deep into the mud told him he was close. Sergei followed them around a wide bend where driftwood piles sat scattered like old bones. The air smelled of wet earth, river water, and the sharp scent of autumn leaves. Then, without warning, a huge, far eastern brown bear rose from behind a tangled pile of wood. Its fur was damp, clinging to its massive frame, and its breath came out in thick white clouds. The bear had been resting or feeding hidden by the fog. Now it stood tall, startled and tense, its muscles tight beneath dark fur. Sergei froze, heart pounding. The fog trapped them in a small world of danger. Nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The bear let out a deep roar that shook the air and charged with shocking speed. Sergei tried to raise his rifle, but the attack was too fast. He fired one desperate shot, the bullet striking the ground at the bear's feet and throwing up dirt and stones. It did nothing to slow the animal. The bear lunged, a blur of power and weight. Sergei jumped sideways, barely escaping the full force of the swipe. The bear's paw slammed into his pack instead of his spine. The hit felt like a hammer blow, lifting him off his feet. He flew backward, crashing into the icy river. Water swallowed him instantly, the cold punching the air from his lungs. The current grabbed him, spinning him away from the bank as the fog swallowed the bear from sight. The river roared in his ears as he struggled to stay above the surface, each second dragging him farther into danger. The river dragged Sergei farther downstream as icy waves crashed over his head. Each roll of the current pulled him under, spinning him against stones and broken branches. His chest burned as he fought to breathe, and the freezing water numbed his hands until he could barely feel his fingers. The fog above him twisted into pale shapes, making it impossible to tell how far he had drifted from the place where the bear attacked. All he could do was keep kicking and pushing upward whenever the current let him rise for a moment of air. A sharp rock suddenly pressed against his side. With the last of his strength, Sergei reached out and caught hold of it. The pull of the river tried to tear him away, but he locked his arm over the top of the boulder. His muscles shook from cold and strain as he slowly pulled himself upward until his chest lay across the wet stone. For a long moment he stayed still, letting the water rush past him while he tried to catch his breath in the freezing air. Bit by bit, he slid his knees onto the rock and then crawled toward the shore, each movement stiff and shaky. When he reached the gravel bank, he collapsed onto his side, coughing river water from his lungs. The world around him was hushed, the fog still thick, hiding everything beyond a few steps. He listened for the roar or heavy steps of the bear, but the wilderness was silent. There was only the cold, the rush of the river, and the sound of his breath coming in weak bursts. Sergei forced himself to stand because he knew he could not stay still. Wet clothes in such cold could finish what the bear had started. He moved inland toward a line of low shrubs and trees, hoping to find some shelter. His legs trembled from exhaustion, and deep ache spread through his back and shoulders where the blow from the bear had struck his pack. He kept walking, guided only by instinct and the dull outline of land rising away from the river. At last, he found a small hollow beneath a leaning tree. There he sat, shaking violently as the chill worked deeper into his bones. He stayed alert, watching the white fog drift between the trunks. When the sun finally broke through the mist hours later, warmth returned slowly. Sergei rose again, battered and sore but alive. He understood now that the river, the fog, and the beasts of Kamchatka carried more power than any hunter. That morning by the riverbank changed him forever, marking the land as ruler and him as only a passing guest in a world far stronger than he had ever imagined. October 2023 settled over the Yukon with a cold, heavy quiet that wrapped the land in fog and deep stillness. Hunter Elias Novak moved through this harsh place with steady purpose. He had grown up around wild country, learning from older family members who spent years studying big game across Canada. By his 20s, he understood how animals moved through valleys, how weather shaped every sound, and how fast danger could rise without warning. Now, in his 30s, he often traveled alone, trusting his experience and calm nature more than anything else. He enjoyed the slow rhythm of early mornings in the wilderness, believing the mist and silence were part of hunting's challenge. On this trip, he carried light gear, a sturdy pack, and a well-used rifle slung across his shoulder. The rut was in full swing, and bull moose wandered through alder thickets and creek beds chasing scents and sounds. Elias wanted a clean hunt across the foggy ridges, but he also knew that bulls during this season were unpredictable and restless. Even for someone like him who knew animal behavior well, the Yukon always held surprises. As dawn spread faint light over the land, dense fog rolled between the ridges, thick enough to swallow whole shapes. Elias could barely see 20 feet ahead. Every step sank into soaked moss, dampening his boots and sending the cold through his legs. He kept moving carefully, lifting binoculars often, though the mist made it almost impossible to spot distant shapes. The only clear things were the faint smells of wet earth, alder leaves, and the metallic scent of the creek somewhere ahead. Then, through the white veil, he caught a shape, broad antlers rising above a low creek bed. His pulse rose with focus, not fear. He crouched low and shifted his steps so the moss wouldn't make noise. His breathing slowed as he stalked forward. The fog clung to his jacket, beating on the fabric like small crystals. The antlers moved slightly, so he edged down toward the creek, thinking the bull might still be calm. But before he could reach a stable position, the world shifted in an instant. A huge form burst from the mist with violent force. The bull moose sprang through thick alder branches, water spraying from the ground as it charged. Elias staggered backward. The bull wasn't running away, it was running blind, crashing through fog and brush in full rut frenzy. Elias tried to step aside, but his foot slipped on slick stones at the creek's edge. He fell hard and slid straight into the icy water. Cold exploded across his body as the moose thundered past, hooves churning the creek like pounding hammers. One heavy leg struck the water inches from his shoulder, the wave nearly pushing him under. He grabbed a half-submerged log, clinging as the bull swung around in confusion, its antlers scraping the muddy banks. The animal circled in the fog, lost and wild, while Elias struggled to keep his grip in the freezing current. Elias held tight to the wet log as the bull moved through the thick mist, its heavy steps echoing across the creek bed. The cold water dragged at his clothes, making it hard to lift his arms or shift his body. Each breath felt sharp, and the icy current pushed against him with steady force. The bull circled once more, its dark shape fading in and out of the fog, hooves splashing through the shallow edges as it tried to understand the strange movement in the creek. For long moments, Elias stayed as still as he could, knowing any sudden motion might draw the animal back toward him. The bull paced along the muddy bank, its sides heaving, its large head sweeping through the fog. It scraped its antlers against low branches, sending small clumps of wet leaves into the air. The fog made the world feel small and unreal, as if everything existed only a few feet away. Elias could barely see past his own arms wrapped around the log. At last, the bull turned and pushed through the thick alder, moving uphill. Its body became a shadow, then a faint outline, and finally it disappeared completely into the shifting white air. Only the fading sound of hooves breaking soaked earth told him it was gone. Elias waited a little longer, forcing himself to breathe slowly until he was sure the clearing was empty. He pulled himself out of the creek with stiff arms, his clothes heavy and dripping. The cold wind cut through the wet fabric, and his shaking legs struggled to hold his weight. Moss and mud clung to his jacket as he climbed onto the bank. His back and shoulders throbbed where he had hit the rocks, and his hands were numb from gripping the log. He looked around, but the fog still hung low, hiding the path he had followed earlier. Elias moved carefully across the soft ground, trying to keep his footing. Each step sent a jolt through his chilled muscles, and the wet air made it hard to warm up. He knew he had to reach higher ground before the cold weakened him further. As he climbed toward a stand of spruce trees, the fog thinned just enough for him to see the ridgeline ahead. When he reached a sheltered patch beneath the trees, he stopped to catch his breath. The shock of the charge, the freezing water, and the narrow escape left him drained. He understood then that the fog had not just hidden the bull from him, it had confused the animal as well, turning a simple movement through the valley into a dangerous moment he could never have predicted. In the quiet that followed, Elias realized that hunting in this wild land demanded far more than skill. It required patience, awareness, and respect for how fast everything could change. The mist, the ground, and the animals all carried their own risks, and he walked away knowing he had survived more than just an encounter. He had survived the harsh truth of the Yukon wilderness. It was October 3rd, 2024, when the gray sky hung low over the rugged Chugach backcountry of Alaska. The wind moved through the valleys like a steady breath, brushing against the thin layers of frost that clung to the alders. Reed Callahan, an experienced hunter in his 40s, had spent most of his life exploring the wilderness. He worked part-time as a wilderness guide during the summer months and spent the colder seasons tracking game for local lodges. The solitude of the mountains never frightened him. He had grown to trust his instincts and his steady hands. That morning, Reed had set out before dawn to scout for late-season mountain goats. The slopes were slick with moisture, and the air was sharp with the scent of pine and cold rock. He carried his .338 Winchester rifle slung across his shoulder and a pack filled with essential snacks, gear, and a trekking pole that had followed him through countless hunts. He moved carefully along the narrow bench of alder and shale, his boots crunching softly in the frozen soil. The mountain was silent except for the faint groan of shifting stone. He lifted his binoculars, scanning the cliffs ahead for movement. His eyes followed a small ridgeline dotted with white patches of lingering snow. For a while, everything was calm until a strange sound broke the quiet. It was a rhythmic snapping, low and steady, echoing through the brush below. Reed stopped, thinking it might be a goat loosening rock as it climbed. He moved forward slowly, crouching low to stay hidden among the branches. The snapping grew louder, more deliberate, like wood breaking under pressure. As he peered through the brush, his breath caught. Standing no more than 30 yards away was a massive black bear, its dark coat slick with morning dew. It wasn't grazing or foraging. It stood tall on its hind legs, swaying slightly, its lips drawn back to reveal yellowed teeth. Reed had seen many bears before, but this one wasn't behaving normally. It wasn't startled. It wasn't curious. It was standing its ground. Before he could lift his rifle, the bear dropped to all fours and lunged. The crash of breaking alders filled the air as it thundered toward him. Reed's hands fumbled for the rifle, but the beast was too fast. He fired once, too quickly, the bullet tearing into the brush beside it. The next moment, the full weight of the animal struck him like a wall, knocking him backward. He tumbled down the slope, branches clawing at his coat, dirt and stones raining around him. The rifle slipped from his grasp as he hit the ground hard. The bear was already upon him, snarling, its teeth flashing as it snapped inches from his face. Reed could smell its breath, feel the heat of its body, and hear the deep rumble in its chest. Panic surged, but instinct took over. He jammed his trekking pole upward, driving it between the animal's jaws. The beast recoiled with a furious roar, shaking its head violently, splintering the pole in half. For a brief second, Reed rolled to the side and scrambled down toward a narrow shale chute. Blood trickled from his arm, his vision blurred, and his legs slid on loose rock. Above, the bear stood again, its dark form outlined against the cloudy sky, watching, silent and unyielding. Reed slid farther down the loose rock chute, his palms scraping against the sharp surface as he fought to stay upright. The cold air burned in his lungs, and every breath felt tight as he looked back up the slope. The black shape above him had not vanished. It stood near the edge of the alder bench, its body still and heavy, as if studying every move he made. The broken pieces of the trekking pole lay scattered between them, showing how close he had come to losing everything in those frantic seconds. The animal stepped forward again, slow and steady, pushing its weight across the shifting stone. Each movement sent small fragments rolling down toward Reed, reminding him how unstable the mountain had become under the pressure of the earlier struggle. He crawled across the shale, his boots slipping on the smooth, flat pieces that shifted like glass under his weight. His arm throbbed from deep cuts where the animal's claws had torn through his coat, and warm blood soaked into the fabric. The silent approach of the creature made everything worse. Most animals broke off when challenged, but this one acted with a strange calmness, as if nothing would make it turn away. Reed pulled himself behind a low rock outcrop, trying to use the uneven shape as cover. The slope continued to crumble under the weight of each cautious step he made. Above him, the bear moved again, its paws pressed deep prints into the layer of broken stone, and its breath came out in slow bursts of white mist. Reed felt the mountain tilt slightly under him as the loose shale shifted again, threatening to send him sliding even farther down into an unseen drop. He kept low, his hands trembling as he felt the surface beneath him crack. A sudden rumble echoed across the slope. A large sheet of rock loosened high above, sending a sudden wave of shale sliding down the chute. The unexpected movement startled the animal at last. It jerked back as the rockfall thundered between them, dust rising in a thick cloud. The animal hesitated, stepping away from the drop as the unstable ground buckled and snapped under its weight. Reed watched as it backed toward the alders, unsettled by the shaking stone beneath its paws. The bear finally turned, vanishing into the thick brush. Reed stayed still for a long moment, his limbs trembling from exhaustion and fear. The dust settled slowly, leaving behind scattered shards of rock and deep prints showing how close the animal had been during the final moments. He forced himself to move again, dragging his aching body down the chute until the ground finally leveled. The cold air felt heavier now, filled with the metallic scent of blood and the earthy smell of fresh rock. He wrapped his injured arm in a strip of cloth torn from his pack, the fabric soaking quickly. Each heartbeat reminded him how dangerous the mountains could be, even for someone with years of experience. Reed pushed through the lower brush until he reached a safer patch of ground where the slope eased. He could still feel the heavy presence of the creature lingering in his mind, its strange refusal to break away even after the fall. The memory of its steady steps and its unbroken stare followed him as he limped through the valley. When he finally reached the trail leading back to his camp, his clothes were torn, his body bruised, and his breathing deep. The wilderness around him looked unchanged, calm and quiet, masking the chaos that had unfolded hours earlier. He knew he had survived only because the mountain itself shifted at the right moment. The aftermath left him shaken. The cuts and bruises would heal, but the image of the animal holding its ground would stay with him. In a place where most creatures avoided confrontation, he had crossed paths with one that refused to step aside. Reed understood then that the backcountry held stories far harsher than anything he had faced before, and he walked away knowing he had been given a rare second chance. It was December 4th, 2020, deep in the frost-covered slopes of Slovakia's Little Carpathians. The cold air hung heavy over the pine forest, and a thin mist drifted between the trees. Milan Kovac and Oscar Petrov, two seasoned hunters from a nearby village, were on their yearly winter hunt. They had grown up exploring these mountains, learning how to track red deer through the rugged terrain and survive in biting wind and snow. Milan, the older of the two, was known for his patience and steady aim. Oscar, younger and strong, had an instinct for spotting tracks others might miss. Together they formed a quiet but skilled pair. That morning they had left before dawn, following a narrow path that wound through frozen ridges. Their rifles hung from their shoulders, and each breath rose in clouds of white. The world was silent except for the crunch of their boots on the icy ground. The sun climbed weakly over the horizon, casting pale light across the snow-dusted pines. As they moved deeper into the forest, they noticed the familiar signs of deer, hoof prints pressed into soft patches of snow, and small clumps of fur snagged on low branches. But soon, something else caught their attention. The soil along the trail was torn apart, and the underbrush smashed flat. Nearby tree trunks bore deep, rough gouges, marks carved by massive tusks. The hunters exchanged glances. These were not deer signs. A wild boar and a large one had passed through recently. The disturbed ground was fresh, the scent sharp in the cold air. They adjusted their rifles, nerves tensing. A full-grown male could weigh over 400 pounds, strong enough to shatter bone with a single charge. They followed the trail into a narrow ravine, its floor slick with frost and scattered stones. The slope on either side rose steep and jagged, the kind of terrain where a single wrong step could send a man tumbling. Milan moved first, careful but confident, his eyes scanning ahead. Oscar walked close behind, gripping his rifle tight. Halfway through the ravine, Milan's boots slipped on a patch of icy shale. He stumbled forward, arms flailing for balance. In that instant, a violent sound tore through the quiet, a deep grunt and the crash of branches breaking below. The snow exploded upward as the boar burst from the brush. It was enormous, its dark fur bristling, tusks glinting like knives. It charged uphill with terrifying speed, its hooves pounding the frozen earth. Before Milan could raise his rifle, the animal slammed into him, the impact throwing him backward. He slid toward the cliff edge, scrambling for a hold as loose stones gave way beneath him. Oscar raised his weapon and fired. The first shot hit the animal's flank, the second into its shoulder. The boar spun, roaring in pain, striking its tusk against stone, sending shards flying. For a moment, the forest seemed to shake with its fury. Then it stumbled and fell, tumbling into the snowy ravine below. The hunters stood still, hearts pounding, surrounded by a shattered silence. Snow settled slowly over the ravine as the echo of the struggle faded. Oscar steadied his breathing while scanning the broken slope below. Milan lay near the edge, shaken but conscious, his jacket torn and scraped from the violent slide. The cold air bit into their skin as they gathered themselves, trying to understand how quickly the mountain had shifted from quiet to peril. The steep walls around them felt even narrower now, their jagged sides rising like frozen barriers, trapping them inside the canyon. Oscar moved carefully toward Milan, helping him sit upright on the icy ground. The path behind them was too slick to climb without risk, and the surface crumbled under every step. They knew they had to descend into the ravine to make it out safely. The fallen animal lay motionless at the bottom, its dark shape half covered in frost. The hunters stayed alert, knowing that wounded boars sometimes fought until their last breath, but this one remained still. The snow around it was disturbed, showing the violent tumble it had taken after the shots. They started the slow descent, testing each foothold along the cold stone. Milan winced with each movement, pain shooting from the bruises along his back and side. The tension of the moment still clung to them, mixing with the bitter air that cut across their faces. The canyon floor was uneven, a mix of frozen mud and scattered rocks, making each step careful and deliberate. When they reached the bottom, they moved wide around the fallen animal, keeping distance as they checked the area. The ravine walls rose sharply, leaving only a narrow exit where the stream bed widened. They followed it, moving between exposed roots and loose branches. Every sound felt louder in the quiet, the crunch of frost under their boots reminding them how unstable the ground was. Their clothes were damp with melted snow, and the cold wind stiffened their fingers as they pressed on. Climbing out of the canyon took time, each ledge slick and unpredictable. The weight of their gear made the climb harder, but they kept steady, helping each other across the most dangerous spots. When they finally reached the top, both dropped to their knees, breathing deeply as the open forest stretched before them. The sky above was pale and the trees stood silent as if nothing had happened. Their bodies ached and the adrenaline slowly faded, leaving exhaustion in its place. They knew how close the encounter had come to ending in tragedy. The mountains were quiet, but the memory of the sudden attack stayed sharp, reminding them that strength and skill could not control the wild or the unforgiving terrain. As they walked back toward their village, scraped, sore, and humbled, they carried with them a deeper respect for the land. In the Little Carpathians, danger waited not only in the animals they tracked, but in the cliffs, ice, and hidden paths that shaped every step.